Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is NatConTalk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. If you are enjoying our videos, you can help us out by subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. Today I'll be speaking with Rusty Reno. He is editor of First Things magazine and the author of Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. Rusty Reno, welcome to NatConTalk.
Great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you, Rusty. I think it's about almost exactly 4 years since you and I met with a whole bunch of our friends in December 2016 in Glen Cove, Long Island, to talk about the great changes in political winds in the United States, the UK, and beyond. And since then, we've done a lot of things together on nationalism and populism, and you've been really one of the foremost speakers as editor of First Things magazine, which for a few decades has been, I would say, the leading conservative Christian magazine in the United States. I myself have written for it a number of times. I think it's a great magazine, and you are just about at the 10-year mark, I think, editing First Things. Why don't we begin by having you tell us what First Things magazine is about?
We were founded to provide a voice for religious people in matters of public importance. Our founder, Richard John Newhouse, was a public figure of some note, and he recognized that the growing secularism of American elites needed to be combated by a magazine that was confidently speaking at the highest, with the highest sophistication about whatever issues that happen to be before us as a nation and the West more broadly. And we've, I think, succeeded in that endeavor for the last 30 years. We just marked our 30th anniversary.
And in the last few years, First Things has become a little bit notorious because under your editorial leadership, it's become one of the foremost nationalist publications or populist publications in the United States. Not that many intellectual magazines, journals of opinion taking that direction. Can you tell us how do you see the nationalist editorial line at First Things? Does that fit with Christianity? Does that fit with religion in your view?
When I took over, I started as editor-in-chief in April of 2011. So you're right, I'm coming up on 10 years now. I think my first editorial, or one of my first editorials, was about the war on the weak and the way in which the cultural progressivism, which by and large defines the left far more than economic progressivism of earlier generations, that this cultural progressivism is something that serves the interests of people in the top 10%, but it's really tough on people in the bottom third. And it became more and more evident to me that globalization had a very similar dynamic to cultural progressivism, that the project of opening up the world for markets, which is, I think, probably a fitting endeavor, but people who led that charge in the post-Cold War era, I think, neglected to recognize or neglected to admit, and certainly neglected to inform the public that this would create a new set of winners and losers. And so globalization has been really very good for people at the top 10% and very tough on high school educated Americans. And I think it's fitting that First Things should emphasize nationalist populism, because I think religious people are naturally, they have a natural vocabulary about the common good that lets us think about the challenges facing us in the 21st century rather than continuing to apply 20th century diagnoses and 20th century solutions.
I think it's a little bit strange that we're having debates about the common good. You know, to my ear, the common good is what politics is all about. And I at least have been sort of taken aback to see some of our friends and colleagues objecting to the use of the term common good. To you, common good is a natural religious trope. It's the way religious people should think. Can you help us understand that a little bit?
Well, Both Judaism and Christianity see religion as a communal project, and Judaism more fundamentally, perhaps, than Christianity. But certainly, Christianity sees the church as a fundamental element of religious life, and the church is a communal project. And we're exhorted to care for each other, to provide for each other's needs, and so we've been through a long season in American, especially on the American right. We've been through a long season of emphasizing individualism. And I was just reading something by William F. Buckley from 1970, a list of affirmations that the right needs to affirm. You know, the nation, the vitality of the American people, all things that I think we should be affirming. But the last one, which he says most important, is the superordination of the private vision over the public vision. And I just took me aback. I thought, my goodness, you know, this epitomizes, I think, an earlier generation of conservatism that worried about our society being over-consolidated or our economy being over-consolidated, when in fact, in the 21st century, we face exactly the opposite problem, which is the disillusion and the fragmentation of our society and the triumph of private interest over the common good. And so we as religious folks, I think, have no difficulty recognizing that our civic duty is to serve the interests of the community as a whole. And I think this is going to be one of the most important contributions that religious people are going to make to the politics of the West in the coming decade.
I have on the desk in front of me a book that you wrote that came out a year or two ago. It's called Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West. And it's really an excellent book. The first few chapters of the book are devoted to a kind of a rethinking of what happened to American and Western public thought after the First and Second World War. And William Buckley definitely features prominently there, but I guess the most important of the characters that you describe are probably Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek, maybe Milton Friedman. And in this book, you describe the years after the Second World War as years in which there is an across-the-board rebellion against what you call the strong gods, the ideas of God, truth, country, and family. Can you help us understand that a little bit?
There's no doubt that 1914 to 1945 was a tremendous trauma to Western civilization. The slaughter of the trenches in the Western Front, the failure of liberal democracy in Germany, as well as in Spain, and in, for that matter, in Italy. Or you could even say France also went through terrible. So people lost confidence in liberal democracy, and then the rise of Nazism, Second World War. All this kind of epitomized, which I say is Auschwitz becomes the kind of the symbol of this tremendous civilizational failure. I think it is a Shoah of the West. It's a catastrophe. And one line of thinking is, well, people believed in false gods or false truths, false ideologies. And this diagnosis was not absent in the post-war atmosphere, but the position that gained the upper hand was the belief that it wasn't what people believed, but rather how they believed. They believed too much. They believed too strongly. And if that's your diagnosis of the catastrophes of those of 1914 to 1945, then it naturally follows that you want to introduce into your society what I call weakening motifs that loosen up and degrade these intense convictions. So for me, Karl Popper is the great theorist of the open society. So his diagnosis of the war and fascism and Nazism is that it suffers from the closed society mentality. And he's very explicit in that book that truth is a dangerous word Because if you believe something is true, then you are going to reject the things that are false. And so he argued for a nominalism, and the nominalist is a more, if you will, humble, that the things that I affirm are possibly true. And he had this whole notion of falsification and so on. So in Popper's analysis, I mean, George Soros was a student of Karl Popper's, and the Open Society Initiative, which is one of his foundations, one of his vehicles for political activism, I think is based on this assumption that if you break down the elements of traditional society, then you will prevent the return of Hitler. And then Hayek is I would put Popper as the kind of presiding presence, the figure who epitomizes center-left thinking in the post-war era. The person who epitomizes center-right thinking is Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek also had this same analysis of the over-consolidation of passions leading to the horrors of fascism and Nazism. But he advocated not the sort of cultural open society project, but rather the economic open market, open economy approach. And it's the idea that we will organize ourselves spontaneously as individuals as we pursue our self-interest in the marketplace. And these two views really wind up fusing after the end of the Cold War into what we call neoliberalism, that kind of unavoidable term. And so the neoliberal wants an open society and an open economy. And that's why you could get people arguing for gay rights and economic globalization at the same time. Gay rights is an open society initiative, globalization, establishment of the WTO, loosening capital controls, all those things that were so important in the 1990s to create the global economic system. Those are all open economy initiatives. And that kind of puts us where we are in the 21st century, where this particular project has run its course, and now we suffer from, if you will, endless openness. So we feel like we're living in a world where we're treading water in an ocean with no island in sight.
One of the things I found really interesting in your analysis is the way that you read Popper. You say, look, actually his open society and its enemies is this grand exercise in taking all of the great thinkers in Western history and dividing them into friends and enemies of openness.
Yes.
So that we used to think that Plato was a complex figure and one of the founders of Western thought, but in Popper's hands, he's not such a complex figure. He's like an archetype of the advocate of closedness as opposed to openness. And you basically say that this is where political correctness kind of tries out its first lap around the block, dividing everything into, well, either you're in favor of openness, in which case you're the good guy, or you're in favor of closedness, in which case you're a fascist or a closet fascist or a crypto fascist, and you're leading us to oblivion. And you can sort of find the same kind of dichotomy in Hayek as well. Well, am I reading that correctly?
You're absolutely correct. He divides the good guys and the bad guys, and it turns out that the vast bulk of the Western tradition is unsalvageable because it is mired in this metaphysical worldview that is intrinsically totalitarian. And so you get in Popper really it's the same logic that you get in Derrida and other figures of cultural critical theory that really gained ground in the 70s and 80s. That truth is tyrannical. And, and moreover, that Western culture is fundamentally corrupt. So I agree. It's kind of, the ISI put Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies on one of the 50 great conservative books of the 20th century, which I think is just a mistaken reading of the intent behind Popper's book, as well as the actual substance of what he said.
So this is the consensus that, when the Berlin Wall falls and you get George H.W. Bush saying, singing the praises of, you quote this in your book, it's beautiful, open borders, open trade, and open minds.
And most importantly of all, open minds.
And most importantly of all, open minds. Okay, and so I can, I can sort of sympathize with the visceral reaction to, to all of this openness. I mean, like everybody else, I cherish freedom of speech. I cherish freedom of religion. But when politics as a whole ends up being kind of reduced to openness, it reminds me of this joke that we used to, our teachers used to tell us when we were kids, make sure your mind isn't so open, that your brains fall out. You remember that joke? So nobody makes that joke anymore because openness has sort of finally won. But still, if I could push back just a little bit, what really is so bad about this? I mean, I guess the question is, what do we lose? Because if the alternative is to be closed, right? To be closed-minded, to have closed borders, to be closed to any new ideas or influences. I mean, certainly that sounds like something terrible and monstrous, and so it's not surprising that that liberals are always calling us conservatives closed. That, I mean, I'm not sure how closed we are, but certainly we're closed in comparison to something. So what is it that we're losing by adopting openness as kind of like an ultimate political principle?
Love. We lose love. Love closes, it doesn't open. So in other words, love is to close upon, to embrace. And if we make openness, if we turn open into the all-powerful noun rather than a useful adjective, then we lose a society with the capacity to love.
So, for example, if I decide to marry my wife Yael, then I have closed down this vast range of options. There's endless women that I'm no longer open to. And
right.
as the years go by, I become ever deeper in how closed I am, right? So if that's the metaphor, then the same thing is true about family relations. The same thing is true about religion, about nationality. That in general, when we want to build something, anything at all, we have to be closed to all of the alternatives that, they might have been considered at the time that we were trying to decide what to build. But once you're building, then you're closed, you're constrained to all of the alternatives other than the one that you've picked.
That's correct. So, I mean, love is a great engine of loyalty. And so one of the things, it does close, in the sense it closes your options, because you unite yourself, you seek to unite yourself with the thing that you love. And so, a love of truth is not open to falsehood. I mean, that's just self-evident, it seems to me. And so it's not an accident that we live in a society that prefers meaning to truth, because meaning is open. I mean, it's subjective. It's something, I have my meaning, you have your meaning. But if it's a question of truth, that's something that, well, wait a minute, if I really think something is true, then it's opposite. It's not something I'm open to. And so these are the things that get lost when openness, which is obviously openness is a technique, right? So you say, maybe you say you've got a student that you've got who isn't considering new ideas. You say, you need to develop greater openness. Like Popper needed greater openness to the subtlety of Plato. And so it's perfectly reasonable. But when we turn openness into an end, it can't function as an end. It's an ersatz end. There is no, you can't make, it's like you can't make chaos an end, or you can't make nothingness an end. And also you can't make openness an end.
So one of the most beautiful moments in what's really a very poetic book, I think, is when you towards the end you pick up the theme of what we get out of the word "we," and this is kind of the opposite of William Buckley's insistence that the individual has to be supererogatory over the collective. And I think you're looking for more of a balance, and you're trying to figure out, what do we get from the word we? And I do think that you conclude that that the term we, when it's applied to family, when it's applied to community, tribe, nation, that the word we actually gives us something that is more precious than our attachment to universal humanity. Now, that's something that's I'm sure difficult for a lot of people to hear. Could you explain to us how can the we give us something more precious than what we get from our attachment to universal humanity?
It's not clear to me we can be attached to universal humanity. It's an idea, not a reality. It's a reality in a conceptual sense. There does exist a human nature. It is something we all share. It's something we ought to honor, but it's not a living community of people. And so it doesn't function as a we. We don't talk about we, the people of the globe, the earth. We do speak about the United States of America. Or we can say, we, the members of my family. Or we can say, we, the football team that I play for. And so one of the great blessings of the pronoun we is that it draws us outside of ourselves to link us to projects of common purpose. And this is something that all human beings seek. It's St. Augustine. I learned from him. We're made for love. And so we are not made to live for ourselves. We're made to live for something greater than ourselves. Now, ultimately, as a religious person, I think we are made for to honor, serve, and love God above all things. And it's idolatry when we love other things more than we love God. But the lesser things that we love, the loves that we share, is a preparation of the heart for a higher love. And that's why nationalism, while it can become a perversion, is a fitting affirmation for a person of faith. Because it's just as the love of family can become disordered and supersede a proper love of God, so also love of nation can become an idolatry. But when love is properly ordered, then our souls are trained to live for that which is higher rather than for ourselves. And that's the problem, I think, look, there are plenty of social situations when you want to urge greater freedom for the individual. We can all imagine those situations. And I think Buckley made these general statements. I think he was seduced into making general statements about the priority of the individual over the common project. He was seduced by the circumstances of the post-war era and taking, if you will, a tactic or a practical judgment about what's necessary for the era in which we live and making it into a universal political principle. And that's, I think, that's one of the things that we inherit in the conservative movement, which is a tendency to take the fitting judgments of the post-war environment. The American economy was over-consolidated. It did need to be opened up so that the creative juices could flow. Arguably, the bourgeois society of the 1950s was too constraining and needed to be opened up. At the very least, it needs to be opened up from its racial exclusion of the 50s and 60s. But it doesn't follow from that every era faces over-consolidation. And in fact, I think anybody with half a brain who looks at our societies in 2020 can recognize that our greatest threats are too much fluidity, a lack of loyalty that we all share, the disintegration or fragmentation of the collective we. This is why people worry about polarization in America. People worry about income inequality in America. And these sorts of things are problems of a lack of unity. And unity is not, you cannot generate unity through openness.
Let's fast forward now to 2016 and the nationalist uprisings political uprisings in the UK and in the United States, preceded and followed by increased nationalism in Eastern Europe, in Italy, in Brazil, India. I mean, there is a worldwide movement in the direction of less openness, a demand for, as you're putting it, a demand for love of nation, a demand for love of the particular and recognition of the commitments that bind us to our fellow citizens. And interestingly enough, it's not happening in one place. It's happening all over the place simultaneously. I have to say that your early support for the nationalist side, very brave thing to do in the context of the hatred and the hysteria that was going on. And I wonder at this point, now that we're 4 or 5 years into it, how do you see where we've been in the last 4 or 5 years, and where do you think we're going?
Nationalism is an approach it's an approach in the political moment that says that we need to give priority to our national interest, and we need to rebuttress our national unity. Populism is more descriptive. It says that populism is a moment when the many rebel against the leadership of the few. Or if you will, the credentialed establishment leadership loses trust of the general populace. I think we're in a populist moment, there's no doubt about that. So the question is then, why has the establishment lost trust? And, I think my sense is that ordinary people are increasingly anxious that the people running their countries do not have the best interests of their countries at heart. Now, that's obviously false at one level, at the level of intention. I think most of the globalist establishment in the United States thinks that they're serving the interests of the country. So let's bracket accusations about intention. But you can look at the consequences and you can begin to think, now, wait a minute. You've got Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and Wall Street. These are industries that have a tremendous interest in economic globalization, and they benefit from it. Then you compare high school educated workers in Ohio, and you say, well, wait a minute, they don't really benefit so much from that process. And good political leadership, always has to balance interests and so on. But we look back and we realize that, wow, before Trump appeared on the scene in 2016, very few people were even willing to acknowledge that there were any losers in this process. And that, I think, led the general public was becoming more and more aware, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are we being led in a direction that clearly benefits some but not many, not most? And can we really trust these people going forward? And I think that's the dry tinder in which the populist rebellion takes place. And I think it's our job, your job, my job, and the job of others is to give that frustration and anger a fitting nationalist focus. So it's not just a blind rage. That you can say, okay, right, no, there are problems. Here's one way of thinking about a future. And it's a future where we re-knit the interests of our elite with the interests of the common citizen. Because those things need to be brought together so that ambitious, talented people, as they push for success, can do so in a way that benefits the nation as a whole. And that'll be different. What works in Israel is not necessarily what's going to work in the United States. It's not necessarily what's going to work in Britain, not necessarily going to work in Poland. Each country has a different tradition, a different set of circumstances. The United States is particularly interesting in this regard because we're a huge country. We're also we function as a hub for the global economy. Our military provides security for the global system as a whole. And so what is nationalist in the United States may still have a strongly internationalist complexion because of the nature of our country and the post-war legacy. What which fittingly nationalist for Poland, could be quite different. And the British situation also, I think, is different yet again. And I think one of the great problems that we face, and it's a function of this open society consensus that has become decadent, I think, is this crazy notion that if we just impose the right system on the world, that everything will be fine. And I don't believe that human beings function that way. We each use our freedom to pursue as best we can what we think is in the best interest of our communities, our families, our local communities, and our nations. And I just don't think we can do that with respect to the globe as a whole. And I've had this debate with some of my Thomistic friends. I've challenged them, can there be a global common good? And they admit that it's kind of hard to conceive of what a global common good would be.
Going forward, thinking about what conservatives should be concerned about, what Americans should be concerned about, what kind of policies, what kind of vision needs to be offered concretely. What do you think needs to be on the table at this moment?
The big problem is what works for the top 10% increasingly does not work for everybody else. So it's a tendency of the elite in our society, if you will, to co-opt the common good for their own purposes and neglect the interests of the citizenry as a whole. And so one example is marriage and family. They kind of work pretty well for people in the upper echelon. Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, shows that for the bottom third, it's a disaster. So we need cultural policy that restores some authority to the institution of marriage and encourages family stability. Hard to do with government initiatives, but part of that is we need to try. Drug legalization is another area that wealthy people, they seem to be able to manage our deregulated culture. But I think to respond to 500,000 people dying of drug overdose death by legalizing marijuana is probably ought to be entered into the annals of history as the prime example of this government. It just dumbfounds me that this is the course that our elite is taking us on. And then making sure that the religious life of the American people is encouraged, not discouraged, as I think often it is under progressive administrations. So those are some areas of cultural policy. Economic policy, we have to change the guardrails, adjust the guardrails on our economy so that its greater benefits flow to high school educated Americans. I'm not a political economist, but this needs to be the priority. The last generation, things have worked out very well for people in the top 10%, not so well for people with high school educations. And then in foreign policy, we just need to be very disciplined to make sure that the United States' military power is deployed to serve American interests. And this requires rigorous self-discipline on the part of our foreign policy specialists. Do not assume that what was in America's interest during the Cold War remains in America's interest.
When I hear you talking about government policy that makes it possible for people to be religious, the openness of the 1940s, 50s, 60s that you described in your book, it had very, very particular consequences for the way that Americans are educated. I mean, beginning at the end of the 1940s already, the American Supreme Court is intent on separating religion from education in the schools in the United States, something that obviously, reaches kind of a crescendo in the 1960s. And I was kind of surprised looking back. People talk about Reagan as though he's a neoliberal, but one of his first acts in office was to draft and attempt to propose a school prayer amendment, a constitutional amendment that would permit school prayer in the United States, a step towards restoring some kind of balance that would allow prayer and Bible study to take place, at least in those places where people want them. Now, Is that something that you have in mind, or is that simply impossible at this point? And if it's impossible, then what kind of policy could actually support religion in America at this stage?
I think it should be a priority of the conservative movement to overturn the Supreme Court jurisprudence that led to this ridiculous notion that a ecumenical prayer at the beginning of school is a violation of the First Amendment. I think that we don't need an amendment to the Constitution. We just need Supreme Court justices who are not bewitched by this absurd radical separationism, so that a North Dakota school district, if it wants to begin prayer with free and school prayer, can do so. So I think it's a sign of the failure of the conservative movement that during the Reagan administration they didn't give it high enough a priority to push for that sort of initiative. I think this is a miscalculation about the real sources of cultural vitality, which rest upon at least a knowledge of and appreciation for the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's a crucial element of the vitality of our civilization. And so I think that's one thing I would like to do. I'd like to have mandatory biblical literacy as part of our expectations for high school graduates. So we have these national standards now that came up in the last decade, and we should add that. This is not about evangelizing or proselytizing. It's just about basic literacy about the foundational document of our civilization. Far more important and more accessible than Plato and Aristotle, and perfectly within the compass of what a typical high school senior can engage and grapple with. So I think those are two areas where, look, most of religiosity is and ought to be undertaken in this realm of the churches and the synagogues, the mosques, whatever. And it's not the business of government to catechize. It's certainly not the business of government to evangelize. But it is the business of government to encourage the religious life of its own citizens in a way that's fitting to the national traditions of that country. Our tradition in America is a mostly hands-off approach from government. But mostly hands-off does not mean that it should not mean that the government actually prevents sensible efforts to expose young people to the realities of our religious traditions.
What do you think? Let me just push this a step further. In Europe, there, as you know, there's a great showdown taking place between the dominant liberalism of the European Union and an approach that we could call conservative democracy, maybe, in Hungary, Poland, and in other countries. Where just a few days ago, the Hungarians passed a constitutional amendment that decreed that marriage was between a man and a woman, that parents are a male father and a female mother, and that people are the gender that they're born with. How do you see this kind of action? Obviously, in the United States, it's more complicated. The states in the United States are not sovereign. Hungary and Poland still, to a certain extent, are sovereign countries, or at least that's what the argument is about. Do you think that they're going too far?
No, they're trying to defend themselves against a radical experiment, social experiment that we're undertaking in places like the United States and Western Europe. I mean, unprecedented in human history. Are we really going to? What civilization has ever survived that is unable to distinguish between men and women, or unable to recognize that? Just that fundamental difference between men and women. If we can't affirm that difference, it's hard to see how we can function. So they're trying to defend themselves, and rightly so. I would say here in the United States, look, we've got Obergefell. There's other things that have happened that have advanced the ball. But this is no reason why we can't argue for a revision of our divorce laws and roll back no-fault divorce, which I would be in favor of doing. I would also be in favor of instituting a divorce tax, because I believe in trickle-down culture, that the behavior of elites often influences everybody else. And so I would means test it. So everybody with $1 million and greater net worth has to pay 10% of their net worth to the state as compensating it for the costs of divorce, the social costs of divorce, just like we have cigarette taxes. It's a sin tax. So I think there are things that we can do in all of our societies. Look, we should never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There are things we can do in Europe, in France that can be done, things that can be done in the United States. We all have different legal cultures. We all have different political environments. But anyone who cares about restoring moral authority to our societies there's always something to do.
Rusty, I want to shift gears. We're just about out of time. I want to shift gears and ask you a personal question, if I might. I know that you were in adulthood, you were a convert to Catholicism after having been very active in the Episcopal Church, and this is not something that is only personal, although the personal part is interesting. I think that there's quite a few intellectuals in the United States. If you look at an intellectual conservatism, I think there's quite a big movement of people turning to Catholicism. Could you shed some light on, at least your personal story and maybe the more general phenomenon? I think it's something really fascinating.
Well, I mean, let's distinguish between the supernatural and the natural attraction of the Catholic Church. Supernatural attraction, of course, is that the Catholic Church uniquely possesses the truth of revelation. Okay, I got that out there. The natural attraction is that it's the only surviving institution. The synagogue and the church are the only surviving institutions in the West from the pre-modern era. And I mean, universities used to be, but I think that they are now rapidly becoming bureaucratic institutions, really indistinguishable from the sort of corporate bureaucratic nexus that arose in the modern era. And so the natural attraction, I think, is that people want to be anchored in something that has deep roots. And so, this goes back to my open society analysis, that as things become endlessly fluid, and as you're treading water in this limitless sea of possibility, the prospect of some island where you can step out onto dry land that's not moving is extremely attractive. And I think this will become increasingly appealing to people, that the intransigence of the Catholic Church is an asset in a time where people fear that everything is up for negotiation, everything is fluid, everything is dissolving. And I think the intransigence of the Jewish people, even more long-lived than the intransigence of the Catholic Church by millennia, is also, I think, a powerful attraction. And I would say both the Catholic Church and the synagogue become targets of open society bitterness and anger and frustration. Why do these people remain so intransigent? Why don't they just jump into the limitless ocean and swim wherever they want? And so that's another aspect of attraction, is that I think that there's an awareness that if your enemy is my enemy, then you're my friend. People begin to come in the direction of Catholicism and recognize its positive allure.
Rusty Reno, thank you for joining us on NatConTalk.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of NatConTalk. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss us next time.